及咨询。好，那非常谢谢大家。那接着我们要欢迎 Jenny。Let's welcome Jenny to give our next session, and we appreciate for her sharing.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here to join you all. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me this afternoon. I will just share my screen. Apologies for switching to English for this section, but hopefully what I'll present will complement what Jim has already shared with you about the TNFD. I work for WSP based in the UK. I'm a technical director. I've been at WSP for 6 years. Prior to that, I was in the international conservation sector. I worked for BirdLife International. And I have about 20 years experience as an environmental practitioner, very much focused on looking at nature and the value that nature provides to people, society and business. So I'm just going to bring some experience from my team's work with some clients in terms of sharing a couple of case studies with you, but then some key principles around how the TNFD is moving nature-related reporting and awareness within the corporate sector. So thinking about this as a global issue, looking ahead at where nature-related reporting is heading for companies, and then just finishing with a few recommendations for you as you start to think about how you might engage with the TNFD or wider nature-related action across your value chains. So if I just start really giving you a picture of a couple of projects that we've done in the last couple of years, I've tried to choose different sectors to give you a flavour of the breadth of work that's happening in this space. I've also chosen examples where companies have taken a different scope to this work, and I'll explain that as I go through. So this first one is some work that we did last year for a large EU-based company that makes iron and steel. And they wanted to have a framework to enable them to record what their impacts and dependencies were on nature across all of their iron and steel making sites globally. So we worked with them to develop some tools focusing on the LEAP stage, which Jim has talked through, and to allow them to collect data at the site scale that could then all be fed into a standard TNFD reporting template ready for when they do want to produce their first TNFD report for iron and steel making. So this involved doing some pilot assessments at 2 of their sites in Germany to really test out how these approaches might work, how we would collect information, what were the key bits of information that were needed for this particular sector, and then pass that over to the company so that they can take that forward themselves. And as far as I know, it's the first organisation within iron and steelmaking that has got a framework for how they're going to report under the TNFD. This second one is energy generation. So this was a UK-based site where we were this time just looking at a single site. So when I talked about scope, we've had different clients coming to us with different starting points. So the metals company was very much about the iron and steel making part of their business. So that covered lots of different sites, but one sector. And this example here is just one site, so one asset, one power station, part of a much bigger company. But they wanted to really understand how this approach might work and how they might scale it up to do their global assessment next year. So here, similarly, we followed the LEAP approach, looking at what this site has in terms of impacts on its immediate surroundings, dependencies that it has. Water was a particularly high one in this case. And they were very keen to take that beyond just disclosure and really looking at how they could set some key performance indicators, particularly for biodiversity, resulting from the findings of the assessment, and a risk and opportunities action plan. So we've produced all of that for this site, and they're now taking that forward to think about how they undertake their global work across multiple countries. The third example is from the finance sector. So this is work that we started last year and is ongoing. And this is looking at a whole portfolio of assets. So this is a big, again, EU-based company. They have assets all around the world in terms of what they invest in and fund. And they are really keen to understand how they can link a TNFD assessment with the CSRD. Now, the CSRD is a recent legislation that's come in for European companies where they have to, it's a mandatory requirement to report under a number of different reporting standards. It's called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And as of next year, a number of large listed companies will have to disclose on nature-related impacts, as well as a number of other ESG topics. So we're working with them to, again, identify how they can prioritise their assessment, where they need to focus, because we know they have the biggest impacts and dependencies, and how they can collect information in order to develop a roadmap towards action and making sure that they will be able to disclose as required next year under the CSRD and also the TNFD. So that gives a flavour of some of the actual projects that we've been doing. I then wanted to just kind of give some thoughts in terms of how this really applies across all organisations globally. So the TNFD is very strong in emphasising the importance of looking beyond a company's direct operations and looking across the whole value chain. So here's a graphic from ourselves, from some work that we've done within WSP UK that shows our value chain. So we're sitting in the middle here. This is our offices. This is the energy that we purchase. That's our direct operations. Arguably has a relatively small impact and dependency on nature. But we have upstream activities, so we have a number of suppliers, of course. This will be familiar to anyone that's done greenhouse gas emissions work. And we also deliver services to clients, so our downstream value chain. And importantly for us, that is probably our biggest area of impact and of opportunity. So thinking about the projects that we're doing with clients, what we do, where we do it, and how we do it. So that's an example from WSP. And if you think about your own companies, then you will all have your own unique value chains depending on what your business is. So the key things to think about, I think, that are becoming really important are understanding those upstream and downstream value chains. So if we think about supply chains, many of you could be asked by your customers at some point what you're doing about nature-related risk. That might be driven by regulation that they have in their own countries. It might be driven by financial investors who want to understand their exposure to risk because they're investing in your company. And there are a number of other drivers, reputation being another important one. So it's important that you start to understand what your supply chains look like. So what are your nature-related risks? This is quite a neat map that I just found online, which shows some of the biggest products produced by countries around the world. I've just zoomed in on your region here to show, not surprisingly, I'm sure, that electronics is one of the main exports for Taiwan. So it's thinking about, what are the most likely drivers of you being asked to disclose your nature-related risks, and what are they? Do you know? So I also just had a quick look at what some of this might look like for Taiwan. So obviously making electronics, steel imports are going to be pretty important. So you will be taking steel from companies who produce steel. They in turn will be producing that steel from metal that's mined from ore. So if we're thinking about that whole value chain, how do you know that value chain is secure? What do you know about the way that those companies that you're working with are addressing their own nature-related risks, and are they aligning with some of the standards that we're seeing increasingly today? On the left-hand side here is a website that looks at deforestation risks. So this is really focused around countries in the world and products that result from deforestation, so things like beef, soy, wood pulp, obviously. And it just allows you to take a look at a country level at what the amount of those products is that are coming in. So it's just a general steer, again, thinking about what are some of those really key materials that might need to be focused on to understand nature-related risk and to manage that appropriately. So it really is a global issue and requires global cooperation to really understand and shift how things are being done. So in terms of future development then, we know that biodiversity risk is a major issue now, and it's only going to increase. This is the World Economic Forum's Global Risks report that came out earlier this year. In the short term, so in the next couple of years, we don't actually see biodiversity loss on the top 10. We do see a couple of other environmental related issues in green, of course, extreme weather from climate change. But if you look at the 10 years projection here, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse has leapt right up to the third biggest risk that the World Economic Forum perceive globally. So it's absolutely essential that we get an understanding of our role in this and do something about it now so that we can minimise the impact for the future and for future generations. So that's why we're seeing a shift now in legislation, in policy, in corporate behaviour. So just some examples here. The first one at the top here is the development of updated national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So this is a result of the signatory of a number of countries to the latest global goals for biodiversity called the Biodiversity Plan. So that event was COP15 at the end of 2022. They will be meeting again towards the end of this year in Colombia to look at how that implementation is going. So what are countries actually doing now to try to meet those goals that were set in 2022. I mentioned the CSRD, so that's this second one here, which is an EU mandatory reporting requirement that has come in, really to look at ESG as a whole, so human rights, environmental impacts, and sort of social governance related issues as well. So that's quite a stringent requirement that a lot of companies that we work with are trying to understand and get ready for in terms of their reporting systems. And the third one there is also EU regulation related to deforestation. So again here, this is going to impact lots of people, maybe less so in Taiwan, but certainly in areas of the world like South America and Indonesia and Asia, looking at not having deforestation products in the supply chain of EU companies. On the right is just an interesting screenshot from some work that was done by some lawyers in the UK a few weeks ago, where they've actually indicated that if a director of a company does not properly identify and manage nature-related risks, they may actually be exposed to liability because they may not be delivering their duties under the law of the Companies Act in the UK. So there really is an important reason for really putting this at the centre of governance and strategy within businesses now. We're also seeing some convergence, which I'm sure everyone will be delighted to hear. This is an image that the TNFD themselves put together, just showing the plethora of different standards, frameworks, reporting elements, and so on. And all of these organisations are working very hard to try and make sure that they are aligned, that they are saying the same thing, and eventually probably conflated into a fewer number of things to report against. So we've already seen that the TCFD has been integrated into the International Financial Reporting Standards, the IFRS. I suspect quite strongly that we will see the same in a couple of years with the TNFD. So the guidance that we now see as being fairly standalone, I think will become more and more incorporated into these other systems, things like the GRI, CDP, and so on, that some companies will be more familiar with. So it will become simpler, I think, to be able to report under one or maybe fewer frameworks. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the wider picture. So the TNFD is, of course, a disclosure framework. It's really focused on looking at risk management and identifying financial risk associated with biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. But really what it's trying to do is to bend this curve that we see in terms of a current decline in the biodiversity that we have on the planet and the impact that that is having on nature's benefits to people, and really flipping that so that we see an upward trajectory in the next 10, 20, 30 years, so that we can restore and fully recover the wildlife that we have and the ecosystems that we rely on, and be able to develop in a sustainable way going forward. So it's beyond just reporting and disclosure, it's about systemic transformation, and that's really the key message around Nature Positive, that currently business as usual is continuing to degrade the resources that we require to do our business. We can do some things to try and balance that out through things like conservation, through CSR, but in order to really change that trajectory, we need to look at this systemic transformation of how we do business, how we account for nature in our risk management, and how we really try to have a positive impact where it's possible to do so. So, final slide in terms of strategies and recommendations. So this is really drawn from the last sort of 18 months of working with clients on this topic. Familiarise yourself with the TNFD framework. Jim's given a great introduction already to you today. I'd also recommend looking at the TNFD website. They have a series of presentations called TNFD in a Box. They're very useful. They're broken down into different topics, so you can pick and choose which ones you look at, and they really do give you a flavour of what the TNFD is and how you might get started with it. The first thing it's very worthwhile to do is to undertake a gap analysis. So this is looking at what you already do as a business, and there will probably be a lot that you already do that's very relevant to reporting under the TNFD. You'll no doubt be collecting some metrics to do with your water use or air pollution or other environmental compliance issues that you need to collect data on already. They are likely to be relevant for reporting under the TNFD. You will probably have a board, you will have governance structures, you might have people who are focused already on thinking about nature and the environment. That again is a good start in terms of meeting some of those disclosure requirements. So really mapping that out and understanding what you already have as a business helps you to know what's the extra bit that you need to do in order to focus your resource and your time. I'd also say it's key to getting top level leadership. So I don't know who's on this call, but usually we talk with sustainability professionals, so maybe a sustainability manager or an environment manager within a business. And often they need to get sign off from their board or their executive leadership team in terms of spending time and budget to really try and understand the level of nature risk. And that's essential in order to get the support and the allowance really of the time and the effort that might be needed to really kind of take this into the business. So get that top level leadership buy-in, make the business case for why it's relevant for your company. Fourth is about leveraging data and tools. So it's a bit related to the gap analysis exercise, but here really kind of looking at what is it that you already do? Do you have data collection systems? Do you have an ESG dashboard? Do you have tools that you're using in order to measure some of the impacts that you have. Jim mentioned the nature tool as one example. There are lots of other tools as well out there to help, and that some of you might already be using. All of this is relevant and shouldn't be forgotten about. Nobody will be starting from scratch. And then finally, set some strategic targets. So once you understand where you're at, where you want to go, what your sort of support is from leadership, then you can look at what are those key targets that you need to set. You know, where is it that you can have the best impact? What is it that you can measure and demonstrate that you're making progress against? And again, there are frameworks for this. I would recommend, in this case, the Science-Based Targets Network as the key place to go to look at target setting. So if you're interested, we've produced a nature guidebook. The link is provided on the slide here. That really just outlines where things are in terms of biodiversity regulations and frameworks relevant for the private sector, looking at how businesses have an opportunity to halt biodiversity loss, but also create a lot of opportunity, particularly through the delivery of nature-based solutions and in helping to transition towards that nature-positive future. So that's a useful reference guide. And then I also wanted to let you know that we're on the same journey as everybody else. So globally, we've published a statement committing to having a positive impact on the natural world through the work that we do. In the UK, we've signed up to a Nature Positive pledge, and as part of that, we're just about to launch our progress report for the first year, and we're starting to undertake our own global TNFD assessment as well this year, and the results will be incorporated into our next sustainability report. So we're learning on this journey along with everybody else, and that's really important that we take these issues to heart as well. Final slide here, just on some key links. I've mentioned the TNFD website, which is very, very helpful indeed. And thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. I believe that bring us a lot of insight, and we will enter the Q&A session. And Andrea will help to translate from Chinese to English, and I will answer the question in Chinese first. Okay. 好，那我会先针对一些线上的问题进行回复。那如果还没有因为时间关系没有办法就是及时回答完的话，我们会用书面的方式寄给大家。好，那我先针对几个我觉得比较有兴趣或是大家比较比较容易遇到的问题回复。看到一个问题是关于营运据点若位于非生态敏感区，是不是就不用做 TNFD 了？那当然我刚才讲的是就是我们在做 TNFD 的时候，是因为会需要识别一些风险。不过因为但是大家的企业可能会在一些工业区或者是一些人口稠密区，他们都是在一些已经开发的位置，所以当然就不会碰上一些生态敏感区。不过因为口说无凭，所以你要先跑过一次 TNFD， 然后去跟别人讲说你已经做了这一套的 LEAP， 然后去证实说我们的这个营运行为或者是我们厂区的位置，确实呢对生态的影响，或者是生态影响，或者是对于自然的风险的那个几率是低的，所以就是你还是要做 TNFD 去跟别人讲这件事情，因为它是一个沟通工具，所以要让不管是投资者或者是银行融资去了解这件事情，所以就是在工业区还是会建议大家也要做 TNFD。当然刚才讲的是需要优先做TNFD 的行业，对。好，那我目前在开发工具上面有遇到哪一些的困难呢？就是比较困难的是因为英国跟台湾的法规会差异比较大一点，然后像是英国的政府公开的资料跟台湾会比较不一样，所以我们在调整这些系数，然后还需要有一些系数可能是需要就是其他不同专业的学者去协助，因为有一些像是森林碳汇啊，或者是水域相关的，就是都要有不同的专业去帮忙。好。 举例说明一下自然资本跟生态服务。那自然资本我觉得它就是就可以把它想象成是一个自然资源，它是名词，然后它是产品。那生态系统服务，服务2个字就是动词嘛，就是它，所以它是提供一个就是我们企业提供服务的概念。那生态系统服务其实有蛮明确的，就是定义，就是有提供支持，然后供给跟调节，还有文化美感这4项。所以就是有蛮明确的定义，就是可以有兴趣的话，可以在不管是来讯询问我们，或者是就是网络上也可以搜寻一下。好，那接下来换请 Jenny 回答，那我们请 Andrea 来帮我们翻译一下这些精彩的问题。
Jenny, this is Andrea from WSP Taiwan.
Hello.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your insightful talk. Some of our audience had a few questions for you, and I have helped translate some of them into English and put them in the chat room. So would you mind just taking a look at the chat room and help answering some of them? Can you see them?
Yeah, I think so. So the first one I can see in English is about looking at the global value chain and how you you put an extra one in. There was one about suppliers, so I'll answer that one as I was reading it a minute ago. So how do you reduce your impacts on nature-related risk? So I would say, firstly, prioritize looking at your direct operations, and you can apply what's called the mitigation hierarchy. So that's essentially looking at how can you avoid that risk in the first place. If you can't avoid it, how do you minimize it? If you can't minimize it, how do you mitigate? And then finally, what do you do to offset? So that's a fairly standard framework that's been around for quite some time internationally that you would apply. Beyond your direct operations and working with your value chain, particularly suppliers, I would say it's about communication and collaboration. So really taking them with you on the journey, understanding what it is that they do, how mature they are or not around understanding nature. Some companies we've seen, they're thinking about adding some more requirements into their code of conduct that they require suppliers to sign up to. And also things like clauses in contracts and procurement contracts where you might require specific policies or standards or information to be provided by suppliers so that you have some assurance that they are sort of meeting the minimum standards around doing that mitigation hierarchy and recognizing what their risk is and mitigating it. So that's how I'd answer that question. There's one above which I missed. So this is about linking TNFD to various industries. Same approach may produce different outcomes. How do you decide? Okay, so how do you decide what's taken to grant? So one of the first things that you do under the TNFD is a materiality assessment, which again is probably familiar from wider ESG work. That will allow a company to really target what are the key areas for you as a business to focus on. So it might be that water is a major issue. It might be that biodiversity is a major issue. It might be that flooding is a major issue. So there'll be a suite of ecosystem services that you really might want to focus on, which means you don't have to look at everything. And that will be different for different sectors. A really good starting place for that is a tool called ENCORE, ENCORE, that was developed by UNEP FI and the World Conservation Monitoring Centre. It's good to take a very high level view of the sector and what your likely impacts and dependencies will be that you want to focus on. But I would caution using it without validation. So you do really need to have a look at that and apply it to your own understanding of your business. Is there a difference between TNFD and natural capital assessment? Fundamentally, no. So the TNFD really has been built on the principles of the Natural Capital Protocol, which was produced in 2016. Very, very similar in terms of having some principles around transparency, credibility, robustness of approach, materiality assessment, and the way that you go about it. What is different is that the TNFD is really about identifying financial risk. So eventually what they are encouraging companies to do is to look at what could be the cost to your bottom line if these risks aren't managed. What could be the opportunity around doing something on nature-based solutions? For example, you might be able to get finance to do some of these things. So it's different in terms of the final sort of objective, but the process is very much. CBAM, I'm not familiar with. CBAM. Can anyone tell me what it stands for? Otherwise, I'll have to skip that question because I'm not familiar with it, but I'll look it up. Have I missed? How fast will a corporation be able to achieve nature positive? Do they need to make extra efforts? I very much suspect everyone would need to make extra efforts. Whether a corporation can achieve nature positive will very much depend on what it is that that corporation does. There is some work going on at the moment by the Nature Positive Initiative to really try to explain what nature positive might look like for businesses. Nature positive is a global goal. So these are metrics that have been set by nations globally that we need to halt and reverse global biodiversity decline. And that will be based on a series of indicators like critically endangered species and so on. Companies will be able to make a contribution to that. They may not all individually be able to be nature positive by that definition. So I think there is quite a journey to go on collectively about what is a nature positive business. And I think it will be different for different businesses. That doesn't really answer it, but I would just caution against kind of any sort of statements or commitments to say you are nature positive until you fully understand what it is that you might be able to achieve. Biggest challenges. Are you happy for me to carry on, Andrea? I don't want to go over time. There's a couple more questions I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, we could do one more.
One more, okay.
Yeah.
So yes, what was I reading? What are the biggest challenges encountered when implementing TNFD based on global experiences? I think the biggest challenge is join up within the company. So the type of information that's needed usually sits in different parts of the business. So procurement are really important, and it's quite often the case that an environmental manager hasn't really spoken to the procurement team before, and they don't really know who they are or what they do or what data they have. So I think that really is the key challenge. It's understanding who works for the company that has the right source of information that you will need to pull together all of the content that would meet the disclosures. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much for answering the questions, Jenny. I believe the insights you provided would be very valuable for our audience. And for now, we'll move on to wrapping up this session. Thanks.
Thank you.
好，谢谢大家就是今天的参与，再次谢谢 WSP 的 Jim 跟 Jenny，那我们也谢谢大家的参与，那我们今天就到此结束，那我们就下次见，拜拜。